class, you were given a starting project to begin with, which has a lot of the main form done, and then we're adding the patient data class to our project. So there's the main form in the instructions that's shown, but here's our UML that dictates what that patient class should be for that patient object. So the UML, of course, has the name of the class at the top, and then the next box are our properties or fields. And so we have three properties for last name, first name, which are both strings, and date of birth, which is a date time object. And then we have a field that is not a property, and it's a private field named room, and it contains an integer. Then we have methods. We have our constructor for patient, in which we're passing it last name, first name, the room, and date of birth. We have a public method called full name, which returns a string, and it's going to utilize last name and first name. We have a private method called age, which returns an int. It's going to be the age calculated from the date of birth. A method called admitted, which returns a string, and it's going to be in the format of room hyphen full name and age in parentheses. We have another public method called getInfo, and that's going to return the admitted information, carriage return, and the date of birth. That's going to be what's showing us the details when we click an item in our list up here. And then the move room, in which we're going to pass it the new room as far as an integer. Some other tips were given here, and so in addition to creating that class, we're going to have to change a few things in our form CS, line 21, 47, 84, 108, and 103, or 133. Let's go ahead and create that patient class first. I downloaded the Visual Studio project that we start with as provided in Canvas. It's got the main form created, all the controls, and most of the code. We're going to make a few changes. You can see there's a bunch of errors down here. In fact, I get 21 errors when I open this. Most of that, of course, is due because we're referencing the class, but we don't have the class created yet. So that's going to be our first step here in finishing this project. Now, it's not unusual. It's not unusual that maybe you'll inherit a project from somebody else that maybe has left the company you're working for, and you need to go in and finish it or maybe fix it. It's also not unusual you'll be working in a team, and so maybe you're responsible to create the patient class. Somebody else has created the form 1. First thing I'm going to do is come to my program, and I'm going to add a class, and we'll simply call it patient. So here's my patient class. It brings in a few directives that are commonly used, and my namespace is CO3 patient class, and the class is named patient. Now, rather than watch me type in all this code, let me zoom ahead. So I finished writing my patient class. The first thing we start off with inside the class patient, inside the brackets, are our properties and our fields. So remember, we can create a property with the name of the property starting with an uppercase letter. We declare those as public, the data type it contains, so in this case first name contains a string, and then we can specify the get and set. Those are the getters and setters that allow us to access the private field that backs this, which will be the same thing, first name, but with a lowercase initial letter. So the F will be lowercase for that private field that our property front ends. Do the same thing with last name, same thing with DOB, which is a date time object. And then we had a private field named room, which is of type integer. In form 1, we will not be able to access room directly. We have our constructor for patient. We're going to pass it the room, the first name, the last name, and the date of birth as a date time object. Now, if we wanted to also create a constructor where we're passing it a string rather than the date time object, I have an overloaded constructor. Does the exact same thing as the previous one. We're assigning RM to room, FN to first name, LN to last name, DOB to date of birth. So we're assigning them to those properties or to those fields. Same thing here, but here we're passing in a string for the date of birth. When we call the constructor, it will recognize what's the data type for this fourth parameter. Is it a date time object? Is it a string? And it will execute the constructor accordingly. This is overloading. Same name method, different signature of our parameters. So the difference here inside the code for that constructor is DOB rather than equaling DOB up here, the lowercase DOB, the actual date time object. We're going to take the string DOB here and parse it as a date time object. We had a public method called full name. We're simply returning first name and concatenating a space and the last name. We have a method named age. It's returns an integer value, and I think I put in the UML this should be private, so I'm going to change that to private. It's simply going to get the value of the years, and we're going to take the date time object now minus the date of birth. We're going to convert that. We're going to get the total days, divide by 365, and convert that to an integer. And then we'll return the years. Our public method of admitted is going to return a string. Here's the code for that. We're going to have a variable called roomx. And if the room is less than 30, then we know we're on basically floor A or wing A. So roomx would equal an A plus that room number. If it's less than or equal to 60, it's going to be wing B or floor B, and then if it's otherwise, it's going to be floor C. So the room numbers are designated which wing they are in, but we're not proceeding with the A, B, or C that the user would maybe see, or somebody visiting the hospital would maybe see. We're going to return then room with a space and the roomx, and then a space, hyphen space, and the full name. That's going to be our admitted string that we return. And this is what's going to go inside that list box of our Form 1. We have a get info where we're going to display some information about the selection made of the person in that list info. So we're going to return the admitted, which is going to be the room, the roomx, and the full name. So here we're actually calling this public method internally, and that's fine. We're going to do a carriage return and then concatenate date of birth with a space. We're going to get the date of birth converted to a short string, and then concatenate to that some spaces, age, and then their age in years. So here's where we're calling that private method that we created up here. And then we have our public void move room. We're going to pass it a integer variable we're referring as new room, and room will simply equal new room. So that's our patient class. Now let's go ahead and rebuild our solution. We now have still 19 errors. These are all occurring in Form 1. So I mentioned we had to make some changes to 133, 45, 78, 86. That's what's coming up here. Let's go back and look at those instructions. So we had some things specified we needed to change. Line 21, 47, 84, 108, and 133. The first one here, line 21 in our Form 1, is to declare an array named Occupant with 91 elements, index 0 to 90, of type Patient. Now we couldn't declare that array until we'd created the patient class, so that makes sense. I also have a little comment here of look for the asterisk to do comments in Form 1 CS code. So let's go over to our Form 1 and let's take a look at the code. I'm just going to double click on this button of Get Data. And so we can see there's some squiggly underlines here of things that need to be fixed and changed. If we go up to the top and we go to line 21, you'll see there's a comment here of a to-do. Declare an array named Occupant with 91 elements of type Patient. I'm going to highlight through that text and replace it then with my code of declaring that array of 91 elements, which would be a type Patient. I'm going to delete that line, and through the magic of video, I'm going to pause the video here, type in my code so you don't watch you type it in, and we'll explain it. So there then is my line of code declaring an array named Occupant of type Patient, and it's going to take a new array of Patient with 91 elements. Now why 91? We have 90 rooms. Why not go from 0 to 89? Well, most people count starting with 1. So our rooms are numbered 1 through 90. I'm going to ignore index 0. So I want to have elements going from 0 to 90 and not 0 to 89. So that's why we use 91 elements. Now just doing that one line reduced my errors from 19 down to 3. Let's go back and look at our instructions again. So the next information we were given in the instructions was line 47. We need to add a line here to create a new patient record in the occupant array at my room index. So the index rather than integer is going to be my room. It's a variable. We're going to pass it my room, txt first.text, txt last.text. Those are coming from our two text box controls. And the text of the birth date that we're going to parse as a date time object. So it's going to be in a string. It's going to call that constructor that takes a string rather than a date time object. So let's scroll down to line 47. There's our to-do item. And I'll add my code here. So here's the code I'd entered. Occupant, index my room. It's coming from an integer value up here. We're going to pass it or call the constructor of a new patient, passing it my room, the text of our txt first text box, the text of txt last text box, and the text of our DTP birth date. That's our date time picker. And we're going to parse that as a date time object. Our next instruction was to take line 84 and add a new patient record to the new room index of occupant, passing new room and the name and the DOB properties from the occupant current room record. So let's scroll down to line 84. Here's our to-do item. And let's add our line of code there. So here's the line I added. Occupant element new room equals, we're going to call the constructor for patient again, so new patient, passing it new room. Occupant element current room, we're moving a patient from one room to another, so the current room they're in, get their first name, do the same thing to get their last name, and get their date of birth. We're going to transfer that information then to the new room. Once we've done that, then we're going to, it's a little bit later in the code, we're going to take the current room and we're going to change its value so that it's null strings for first and last name, and the date time will just be today. That's going to set that room as an empty room and mark it as empty in our list. Because then we call update occupants list, and then we're also update our data file. So every time we're making a change in terms of adding a patient, removing a patient, or moving a patient, we always want to update our data file so that the data file, if we come back to it the next day, will be the correct data. It will reflect all those changes we made. And I always do it pretty much immediately because you never know when your computer might crash. Let's look at the next item we need to do. And so line 108, we need to create a blank patient record for our occupant with the index of room num, calling the constructor and passing it room num, a null string for the first and last name, and then the date time dot today, and we can form that as a two short date string. So it's basically the same thing we have here as far as occupant current room, but we're going to use room num instead of current room. So I'm just going to copy that line of code, go down to line 108. And we'll paste that line in. Now room num is up here as our integer, so we're going to change this to room num. We want room num here. Make sure I get my comma after that. Now let's take a look at the next one. So on line 133, we have a to-do item of adding a Boolean expression to make sure the first name property of occupant index RM, another variable we're using there for room, is not an empty string, not a null string. So let's scroll down to line 133. So we have our to-do item in here in terms of our Boolean expression. We want to make sure the occupant RM dot first name does not equal a null string. So those are our changes. Now I'm still getting a little error up here on line 120. and it doesn't like the datetime.today.toDate string, and I think that should be a method. So I'm missing the parentheses there. It's not unusual that you might have some code that you inherit from somebody and you find some bugs that need to be fixed. So look for those things. We have 0 errors here. I'm going to save my project and I'm going to test. So I'm going to get my data. In Canvas in modules, we had our patients tab delimited text file. I'm going to download that. I'll go into my downloads. There's my patient file. I'm going to open it. And there are the patients from the data file with some empty rooms. Let's add a new patient. So we're going to add Alvin Aho. And let's just select a date for him. We'll say Alvin was born in 1979, July 4th. Now I can put in a room number such as A09, or I can say randomly find me a room. So let's randomly find a room. It says happen to come up with A09. Could have come up with A06 and or B32, but it randomly found a room, and I'm going to say admit patient. There we go. Alvin Aho is now part of A09. Now if I come and click on his information, we'll see he's in room A09. His date of birth was 7/4/1979. That makes him 42 years old. Okay, let's take Gail Goodyear, and we're going to discharge Gail Goodyear. I'm going to say yes. And then I'm going to take Keith Kingman, and we're going to move Keith to room A06. Type in A06, and I'm going to say change rooms. Now I could also randomly find an empty room as well. We're going to change rooms. So now Keith Kingman is A06, and the room he was in is now empty. Okay, so I'm going to close my application. And I want to restart it because I want to make sure that my data was saved. So I'm going to say get data. I'm going to go back out and find that same patient file that we used earlier. And there is Alvin Aho. In A06 is Keith Kingman. And Gail Goodyear, I forget which room she was in, A12 or A21, has been discharged and is no longer there. So our data is being persistent. And that is the patient class at work. If you just jumped into this video, you can see all the videos from the C# Xamarin Programming Cohort playlist by clicking on the image in the lower right. And if you'd like to be alerted to future videos that I create, you can click my picture up in the top right and subscribe to the channel.